Did Andy use this yesterday? Sucks. I guess the other one doesn't work as well. Testing, awesome. Okay, good morning. Nice to see y'all. It's our first lecture together, which is going to be fun, right? Everybody looks exhausted from yesterday and slightly defeated. That's great. Great start already to the day. Seriously though, how is everybody doing? Seriously the same? Yeah. KB nailed it. It's exactly how you're feeling. That's the wrong date. What's the date today? November 28th? Nice, okay. So I'm told with classes, it's good to start off with a joke. So generally my agenda starts off with a joke. I try to make it relevant in terms of whatever we're covering that week. I don't have any jokes on objects. I probably should, or functions. I have a general software programming joke for this week for y'all. How many software developers does it take to screw on a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. Just blame the hardware anytime something goes wrong. So this is what I'm thinking we'll do. Because it's our first lecture today, we'll talk a little bit about me, but I don't want the lecture to be about me, obviously. So I allocated about 2 to 3 minutes for that. There's specific things I want to talk about in terms of lectures and my lecture philosophy, just to set expectations. I want to talk about my weaknesses a little bit so you all know what those are going in. Then we're going to talk a little bit about something that I think around this time in your journey is a good thing to talk about, which is the software developer approach. I know that was a lecture that was already covered, but specifically I want to talk about reading code. I don't think we talk about this enough. I don't think the industry talks about it enough, so we'll talk about it. Then we'll do a little bit of review. I think it'll be half review, half new stuff. How many people are excited about review from previously / yesterday? Most of you. Okay, that's good. So for review, I was thinking we'd go into a little bit into functions because that's a big part of what you'll be working on, or you already have been, but more of what you'll be working on today, this week, so on. We'll talk about callbacks near the end of the lecture. That's the title of the lecture, I believe, in Compass, right? Is it callbacks? So we'll talk about that. And functions essentially get used as callbacks, so we'll talk about how, but we'll build towards it. I don't like to start off with solution. I like to start off with problem and then solution so we can at least somewhat relate why are we learning this, right? Is that all cool? All right. So about me, a little bit of background. So I mentioned on day one when I quickly introduced and bolted that my initials are KV, so people generally call me KV because my name generally is pretty hard to say. I think I struggle to say it now, quirky fact. Like I can't say my name properly to people unless I'm speaking my native tongue. So certain people, they ask me like, no, what is it really? I'm like, you don't speak Urdu, so I'm going to struggle. It's just this weird mental block. Wasn't always like that. That's what it is today. I grew up in, most of my time was in Ontario. Previous to that, I was in Pakistan growing up. I'll give you another quirky fact about me, even though we did one. The one I talked about on day one was like klepto, right? So in Pakistan where I grew up, the water was like, there's a coastal city called Karachi, and it's like it's coastal, so there's a lot of beaches and stuff, but the beaches aren't very clean. And my favorite thing to do as I was a kid was to go in the water. We would go every weekend or so, and I would go in the water, and guess what I would do? You'd think I'd pee, right? No, I'd drink the water. I found seawater delicious. I still do, actually. It's just that taste, like whenever I go in the ocean right now, I'm tempted to drink this. It's just so good. And I would vomit like every time, because like all that salt going in, not so good. Like dehydrates you like instantly. And my parents had no idea why I would constantly be throwing up on the beach. And like that water was not clean, right? There was like the clean side that you swam on, and then you saw the dirty side that you did not swim on. Anyway, lots of mercury up in here. My background in terms of professional software developer, did a computer science degree at University of Guelph, really enjoyed it, 4-year program. The best part of it was the co-op, where actually like even starting in year 1, I think it was, started working at companies doing either support or software development, and both of those were incredible experiences. always saw myself getting into teaching, even T8 in university, high school, and so on. And thought I would like work as an instructor part-time or something while having my own startups. Even thought about applying to like a Seneca type college in Ontario while I was managing my own startup. And decided boot camps happened, and I got roped in essentially into helping Canada's first one set up shop in Toronto, Bitmaker Labs. They approached me. I think it was 5, 6 co-founders, all business grads. Didn't know anything about code, but saw an opportunity and hired myself and a bunch of other people part-time to help them build curriculum as well as teach. Loved it. Loved the experience because I get to, instead of trying to change the system from within at an existing college, got to kind of build one, which is pretty cool. But it was doing it part-time and like, like trying to do 2 things at once. You never really do both things really that well. So decided to stop it after a few cohorts, focus on my startup again. Not startup, my consultancy. And then decided after that I kind of got tired of doing consulting work. Bored of it, to be honest. Didn't really feel like I was growing. And I always get anxious when I'm not growing. Like when I'm not learning new things, that's when I'm most anxious. Not when I'm faced with like some kind of challenge, right? I think most of you, I find when speaking with our students, it's the same kind of feeling, which may be why you're here, right? And then a year later, decided to move to Vancouver. My wife and I were like, we're done with Toronto, let's move. And also decided to start Lighthouse Labs. That was in late 2013. And then the rest is history. My style of lecture, it's definitely very code editor heavy. I guess, who have you had so far? Andy? Have you had Nima yet? And you've had Travis? Not yet. So, sorry? Just Andy and Nima, yeah, because you've only had day 2 and day 3, right? And you'll have Travis as well. He's one of the full-time instructors here as well. He's awesome. Everybody has slightly different styles, but I think most of us tend to use text editor, a code editor more than we tend to use slides for most of our lectures. I tend to focus a lot on philosophy, approach. You're not here to learn about, even though our curriculum outline talks a lot about technologies, my belief with software development is that the technologies change so fast on you that really it's about how do you keep up and also how do you learn quickly, right? So how do you dev quickly? How do you learn quickly in a new environment? And you guys are going through a new environment, right? New way of thinking, new language, syntax for some of you, right? Or all of you. So how do you deal with that? So I focus a lot on approach, while also bringing new topics up like callbacks, for example. But I won't spend the whole lecture on that. And even teaching callbacks, I'll try and focus on how would we go about learning that on our own if we had to. I'll try to anyway, right? So I focus on like the learning and the iterative process. Weaknesses, I tend to talk fast. Have you noticed? So this is like the beginnings of it. Hopefully I'll try and curb it a little bit. I've been trying for the last 6 years. Clearly not working very well. Actually, this is an improvement. I get excited about things and I talk really fast. Feel free to slow me down. And that's what these are here for as well, is to help me kind of slow down. I like to take long, awkward pauses during lecture. Partly to slow down and think before I speak. And partly also to facilitate questions and discussion. I loathe lectures that are very much like what I'm doing right now, talking at you. I find my attention span is 5 to 10 minutes and then I zone out. I don't know what just happened with the lights there, but I think it's great. And I don't blame you if you zone out during lecture, right? If you are like, I go, hey, what do you think about what I just said? And you're like, sorry, could you repeat that question? I wasn't paying attention. No judgment from me on that, okay? And no judgment from classmates, hopefully, either. It's my responsibility to try and keep you engaged. If that's not happening, I mean, it's not 100% my responsibility, but it's like 80% my responsibility. And if I'm not able to do that, that's my bad, right? And so one of the ways I do that is not by talking at you, but by facilitating collaboration. So a lot of what we do here, if it's going to be approach, it's not going to be just me showing you approach. It's going to be us discussing all our approaches. All right, we're going to start off by talking about that kind of stuff. I was talking about weaknesses, and then I started talking about approach again. But yeah, awkward pauses to facilitate questions. If I do talk too fast, feel free to slow me down. Questions and things like that. Oh, other weaknesses. Thanks for asking. I am pretty strong. I'm very strong with like Ruby, Rails, some of the tools you'll be using or learning. Fairly strong with JavaScript as well. But in my professional career as a software developer, I've definitely used more Ruby than JavaScript. It's not like 80-20, but it's like 60-40. And with tools like the modern tools like React that you'll be learning, that's why I like tell Davey, don't schedule me for lectures, because I'm not as good. Like I could, but we have phenomenal instructors that can do a better job there. Why am I telling you my strengths and weaknesses around software, what I know and what I don't know? Why do you think? Pop quiz. Yeah, that's actually, you nailed it. I think a lot of people define software developers, senior software developers, if you want to label me as one with 15 years of experience, as how much they know in terms of different technologies or different languages, different frameworks, or even how deeply they know them. How well someone knows React tells you how senior they are with React, how much experience they have with React. That does not tell you if they're a senior developer or not. It could be a proxy. It could kind of give you a hint, but it's not really the right measure, in my opinion. Right? The other reason I'm telling you this is because I want for you to not feel intimidated by teachers or instructors, especially in week 1 where it's like, oh my gosh, these people know so much. How am I ever going to get there? Like, there's just so much to know. And I'm just looking at the curriculum, I'm already starting to feel behind. Like, how am I going to get through it all? Right? Like all the imposter syndrome stuff. It's partly, I think, driven by looking at instructors or mentors going, they know so much. Right? Like, how am I going to learn that? They've been doing it for 15 years. Is it going to take me 15 years to get to that level? And also because I believe that there are different individuals, different personalities, some who try to hide what they don't know. I've definitely had my fair share of teachers in university, high school, who like when they ask a question and they don't know the answer, they like try to like get out of that, weasel their way out of the question. I don't do that. I make an effort in lecture to tell you what I don't know, because I want you to see the gaps that we have, and that it's okay to have those kind of gaps and figure it out kind of on the fly, on the job. That's kind of the job of a developer, is to figure it out. If you ask me what makes a good developer, forget senior or whatever, junior, any title you want to give. What makes a good software developer? Actually, let me ask you, what makes a good software developer? Yeah. Good problem solver, absolutely. What does that mean? What kind of mindset or mentality is that? Yeah, exactly. Do we agree? It's the phrase I like to use is, I don't know the solution, but I know I can figure it out. Right? That's the mindset of a developer. If you know the solution, you're quickly going to be like me and you're going to quickly get bored of it. I think. Right? I'd like to think. Okay, cool. So that's a little bit about me and my philosophies around this stuff. As I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about approach and reading code. So the first thing I'm going to do, section 3, is we're going to talk about reading code. Here's some code. Here's a lot of code. Some of you may have even seen it. It's from day before yesterday as part of Stretch. So it's not a code that I just wrote for this lecture. And look what's happening. It's on the screen. There's a lot of it. And you could be going through something like this if you encountered that Stretch assignment, or in reality, right? This is not a lot of code. It feels like a lot because we haven't encountered so many lines that much yet. How would you go about reading this code if you're encountering it for the first time? And why is that even important? So first of all, why is that important? Learning to read code, why is that important? To understand what the program is doing, you were saying? Same thing? Yeah, it's not always even your code, or it feels alien to you even though you wrote it, because it may have been years ago and you don't even remember what the heck you wrote or why you wrote it, right? Were you going to say the same thing or something else? Yeah. Other reasons? There's other reasons, by the way, why you might be able to why you might have to read code. And I'll maybe add some more context. It may not be on your own screen. You may not have control over the screen, but you may also. And someone might be talking about the code like this, and you have to quickly read it. What kind of situations does that happen in, aside from obviously the classroom? Work? What about, what kind of context in work? Why would code be up on a screen with me talking about the code to a bunch of staff or developers? Debugging? Could be, yeah. It could be group discussion for debugging purposes. Other examples? Or thoughts, ideas? Code reviews, big one. Yeah, absolutely. Somebody does a feature, and depending on the culture and the style in the company, if it's a distributed team, they can't do this. But if they're a small team in a specific office, sometimes what they'll do is they'll sit in the sofa area, put it up on the TV, and actually discuss what they've built, show you the actual feature. Here's what I built. Here's the feature, in terms of what it looks like in the UI, if there's any UI to it. And then here's the code so that we can talk about it. Here's what I struggled with. Here's some of the shortcuts that I took. What do you guys think? This particular thing I'd like some feedback on. You have to read that stuff really quickly and understand. It might not be in the particular product that you're working in, right? So the skill of being able to quickly read code, whether it's for pair programming purposes or your own purposes, you've just inherited that code and you need to actually start working on it. Being able to read it is a skill in of itself, and I think it's a skill that people don't talk about. It's not formally taught. It's assumed that you'll get it over time, which is fine. You learn it through osmosis. But let's talk about some best practices before we move on, shall we? So what are some best practices in terms of when you first see code like this, how should your eyes be even scanning the code? How are you scanning the code? What are you looking for? And everybody has a different style. Just a prefix. I'm going to give you some of my opinion, and I'd like to hear yours. There is no right answer here. There are some preferred answers for different people. Okay, so what are your preferred answers, approaches? I see a hand go up, but I want to wait before that's another thing I do, by the way. I may even mute you if you answer a lot. That's okay, don't be offended. It's a compliment. Temporarily mute. But anyway, yeah. One hand go up, but we've already talked a little bit. Yep. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know names, sorry. It's going to take some time. Figure out what it's trying to accomplish? Yeah. So how do you do that? Even things like names of functions, if they're done well, gives you a clue, right? And that speaks to naming is important. Okay. Yeah, so you look at the name of the first function or the name of a specific variable and use those as hints. I like that. I do that too, if I'm being honest. What else? Yes, yourself? Yeah, looking at the overall structure. Maybe you're not reading it line by line, right? Maybe you're actually saying I'm going to use, what things do you use as ways of deducing structure? Indentation, right? This is why indentation is important. So just seeing that, or you could use something like collapsing in the editor, right? Collapse that function. I don't do that too much, but to each their own. And then you're okay, that's the whole function, but where is it used, right? So then you see as you select it, depending on the editor, that you see that it's used there, right? That gives you a little bit of an idea. What's inside that function? There's other functions inside that function. That's kind of crazy, right? Functions. So something like that, right? And then maybe also reading the names of the functions. What else? Any other tricks, tips? Yep. Yep, that's another great trick, highlighting specific variables, see where they're used. So split date is used here and here and here. Day seems to be, so highlighting that is a bit tricky because the editor just highlights valid day. That's not useful at all, right? That's not the same as day, but it does highlight, it highlights day in here as well. But that seems to be a local variable. So not necessarily guaranteed to be very useful, but gives you some ideas as to where that may be used. For a word like day that's used everywhere, it's a problem. For something like month, still a kind of a problem. So it depends on, what kind of thing you're selecting. It depends on your editor and how smart it is too. What else? Yep. Really good point. Most of the times a function is called, it's after it's defined and therefore near the bottom of the code. So you'd want to kind of go see where it's called. And we see that you're right in this case. And then you can scroll up to see, you can also see what is passed in, right? How it's being used. Okay, it looks like a string is being passed in. And it looks like some kind of a date. And then that sounds right? And then you can kind of go from there. Any other tips? Awkward pause. So I'll tell you my trick, and it's actually an amalgamation of what we already discussed, so it won't be anything too groundbreaking, which is good. I like to read code in the way that JavaScript runs code for the most part. It obviously depends on the context, right? But when I'm trying to debug, I'm trying to figure out why the code is not working a certain way or how this thing actually works, I would call those things debugging. I would run the code in my head as though JavaScript is running the code. So how does JavaScript run the code is my next question to you. What's the order of operations that JavaScript is doing? Is it running line 1 when I run this file? Well, it has to start somewhere. I want to start with line 1. So that's running line 1, right? Yeah. It always has to start at line 1, right? Like, I mean, it's got to start somewhere and might as well start at the top, right? And then if there is like a bunch of stuff that's happening, like function calls and stuff, it'll run them in order, right? But in this case, it's not a function call, it's a function definition. So is it going to get into line 2 right away? No. Why is it not getting into line 2 right away? Line 2 is inside the function. Right? So why wouldn't it run line 2? Because the function, inside the function means this is going to be run when the function is run, or invoked, or called. And the function has not been called yet. The function's just been defined. So literally, JavaScript goes, cool, there's a function. I'll remember this name. I'll remember that it takes in an argument, I guess. And I remember that there's a function. And then it's done with that whole function. And then it moves on. And we're going to do the same. We're like, okay. And then, now what's nice is as humans, we have intuition as well. Node doesn't have intuition. The JavaScript runtime does not have intuition. So we can't be like, calculate day and year. I can guess what that does. It doesn't do that, right? So we actually have a superpower that we can apply, which is with good naming, we can make some assumptions. So we can be a little bit, not faster, but a little bit more lazy, I guess, right? And then the same thing here is multiple, takes in a numerator and a denominator. I can guess what that does. Cool. And then I start to see where the function is called. And then I remember what's passed in, right? And then I go in here. And then at that point, JavaScript is going to run these line by line because these are just variables that are being defined, right? One after the other. But you know, so I don't have to read these exactly and try to figure out their values. I can just kind of, again, start using some of my human strengths and start making assumptions. Then I get to this function definition. Again, it's a function definition. Great. I don't really need to worry about it until it's called. Same thing here. Same thing here. So I'm already just scanning in the way that JavaScript would. And then we start to see some code that's actually calling the function. Days in Feb. Okay, cool. Right? I can assume, okay, but I need to understand what year is in order to understand what days in Feb is being passed in. So now I'm going to understand what year is. And that's what JavaScript would do as well. In order to set this constant, we need to, there's some numbers here, but this one, it's a function call. So I need to evaluate it before I can understand what this array value is, right? And then in order to do that, I need to figure out what year is. Well, where the hell is year defined? It's not this year, because this is the input parameter to this function. And same here. This year should be in this scope, and it should be called year. Aha, right there. Right? And then I go, okay, well, what the hell, what's the value of that? Right? And so on. So I kind of work backwards as I need to be able to evaluate what a value of a variable or a function or, you know, those kind of things are. Is that useful? Do you already do this? Kind of? Yeah. So think about doing that as you progress, because especially right now, week 1, you're dealing with like small lines of code. Quickly that will graduate to larger files, and then many large files. And so that skill is kind of important. Are we good with that? Okay, so we've been writing a lot of functions, like since the prep course, if not before. How many people here wrote code before taking the prep course, i.e. before joining Lighthouse Labs? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people from the program. Sounds about right in terms of the average cohort. How many were like working as software developers before? This is usually like 0 or a very small amount of hands go up. I'm assuming the ones that did go up, it's like learning or side projects and things like that. Yeah, cool. So you've been writing functions for a while then, for those of you, the 6 or 7 that have raised your hands. And for the other ones, you've still been writing functions for some time, and you've written quite a few, starting with the prep course and in week 1, right? And we're going to go further. We're going to keep building on that. And almost every programming language has functions, right? The procedural ones, the ones where like you kind of follow a sequence of instructions. Generally, you want to group instructions into functions, and so they have functions. They might call them different things, but the most common word is functions. But before we get into that stuff, here's a discussion question. Languages aside, right? I'm not asking which languages software is made of, but I'd like to know, what is software made of? What makes up software? It's an abstract question, I know, and there's many right answers, but I have a specific thing in mind, and I'm seeing if you guys are able to jump on that. Yeah. Logic is a great answer. Yeah. Instead of saying like, well, if statements make software and for loops make software, well, yeah, but those are all part of logic, right? I agree. There's one other piece. So there's 2 things that make up software, in my opinion: logic, data. Absolutely. Those are the 2 things that make up software, at least in the lens that I'm trying to apply on this. And what I like to say is, let's go the other way, data and logic. Data is state, the state of a thing. What state is it in? This is just a more technical jargon. So I like to say that software is made up of state and behavior, or behavior and state. It's mostly BS, right? Behavior and state, right? So let's just keep that in our minds as we're working on this stuff, right? Either we're creating functions that operate on data, or we're creating data for the sake of like being able to show that to users or whatever, right? Okay, some code to look at now. We're going to spend about 10 minutes, maybe less, talking about functions as values. So let's take a look. So here's some existing code, so we don't have to write something simple and waste your time. We're going to talk about functions and values and what that means. So let's take a look at line 4 through 6. What is it doing? Talking about reading code. This one's not as crazy. Can you see from that angle? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to try a little bit. Hopefully it's not going to make things worse for people. Is that worse for you guys over there? No? It's okay? Is that better for you? Well, what is this code doing? It's kind of already described, but anyway, it's a good exercise. Yeah?
Just saying hello to the name of the name.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing crazy, you know. So I can just call greet like that, right? What happens if I call it like that? Hello plus undefined is one guess. I'll just say hello is another guess. These are valid guesses. Any other guesses? There's 3 possible outcomes, right? It'll say hello, space, and nothing else after that. It'll say hello plus undefined. Or it'll be an error. And it really depends on the language, right? So I'm asking you a question that's not really that important of a question, because it is, what would JavaScript do? And we're not here to learn JavaScript, by the way. I know this program is a JavaScript-centric program, but you're not here to learn JavaScript. You're here to learn software development, right? JavaScript's just a vehicle. So it's not that important of a question, but it's still good to learn the language that you're learning, right? Just quote-unquote master it to the extent that you can. So it's good to be able to ask these questions, and even ask them to yourself if you're learning a new language. And the tutorial isn't getting you to do this. It's getting you to do it the happy path, which is like put in the value, right? That's the thing that'll make you happy. It's the thing that's expected, right? But sometimes you want to do the edge case or unhappy path to see what the error or other thing, what the behavior is like, to learn that language in that way. And Andy yesterday talked about errors being great, right? I heard him talk about that. So in other languages, this would be an error. For example, in Ruby, this would be an error, as we'll learn later. But in JavaScript, let's see what happens. Hypothesis is, could be one of those 3 things. And maybe mine is that it's hello undefined. What's the file name? 4. Yeah, indeed. Hello undefined. Right? Great guess. But that's not what this lesson's about. So let's put in a value. And we expect to see that value being used in the string. So far so good, nothing surprising here. Any questions about this before we move on? Not move on, but build on it. Any questions? Now, if it was returning a value, we wouldn't see it output to the screen. Do we agree? Something like that? Yeah, it wouldn't show up in the terminal or in the console, right? So then what do I do? Because I'm just going to my expectation now, whoops, sorry, is that it will do what when I run this? I won't see anything, but I won't see an error either, right? I don't see an error because this does, in JavaScript's mind, this gets replaced with whatever's returned, that hello string, but we didn't assign it to anything or we didn't do anything with it. JavaScript doesn't care, right? That's still valid. It'll just throw that value away eventually or immediately. So in order to actually make it appear, I have to console log whatever is being sent back. Now I can assign that to a variable first and then console log that variable. Or if I'm only going to use it once, I'm just going to stick it right into the console log, right? If it's not too complicated to read. If it gets really hard to read that, I might break that into steps. That's where I make those kind of decisions, right? Now when I'm reading this code though, and this is again getting back into reading code, when I get to that line, I don't see greet KV here. I mean, I look at that and I see greet KV, and immediately I want to replace that with whatever JavaScript's going to replace that with, which is the string hello KV, right? And that's again back to reading code, is that you actually want to see it as it's running, and this will start happening automatically. I'm just saying that this will make an effort if you can on this. Is that instead of just seeing that, you start to see that and then quickly replace that in your head once you understand what the function is doing with the actual return value of the function. Okay. So anyway, back to where we were. I like to take a lot of digressions as I'm getting towards my lesson. I apologize if that's confusing. So far so good in terms of my pace. Am I talking too fast? Not too hyper? It's okay. Just running on coffee. Okay. So that should restore the functionality that we had before. We're going to see that thing output. It should say hello KV again. Awesome. And we know that this, we know what this would do. It would do hello undefined, right? What would this do? One guess. One guess is just hello. It's a valid guess. It will throw an error, also a valid guess. Because again, it depends on the language, right? Sorry, error? Not getting a lot of response from people in the back, so I'm going to start picking. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, go ahead in the back. Print the whole function. Because it's like you're not calling the function, you're asking what the function, what that thing is, kind of thing. Also a good guess. Any others? Those are kind of like the three big outcomes. There could be some kind of slight variations on those. This is the kind of way I want you to think. Right? Like, what will happen if I do this? Not sure. 3 different hypotheses. Let's see what happens. Right? Use the scientific approach where you can. Let's see what happens. Let's learn. I'm not going to tell you the answer. We're going to learn together. It did not say hello. It did not say hello undefined. It did not error out. And it seems like there's color there for whatever reason. And it says in square brackets, because I don't think this is an array, but for whatever reason it's got square brackets there. And it says function : greet. Not what you expected, but closer to what you expected, which is it'll print the function. It won't print the return value of the function because you're not calling the function. You're referring to the function. In order to call the function in JavaScript, you have to see the parentheses after it. That's a function call. This is just a function. This is a function. This is not a function call. I mean, the console log is a function call. See this? Parentheses? That's a function call. But greet is not being called. It is being referenced. Defined is above. Right? It's defined and then it's referenced. And then it's like, okay, you asked me what's in there? What's inside of greet? It's a function. Now again, different languages, different thing. In Ruby, it would actually call the function. So it depends on the language, right? What does this tell us? What do we just learn implicitly, or like indirectly? Yeah, we learned two things. In order to invoke the function, you need the parentheses, and a more important or equally important thing that's kind of more indirect. Yep, sure. You can refer to a function by its name, and you can like pass it around. Because what did we just do here? We called a function called console log. That is a function, and then we passed it a value. But instead of that value being a string or a date or a number, it was a function. Right? Functions are values in JavaScript, not in all languages. And so this kind of attribute of JavaScript makes a lot of people say things like this, and you might come across them. In JavaScript, functions are first-class citizens. That's a common thing that you might read somewhere on some article somewhere, right? Or you might hear a mentor say or something like that. Or you might say something like, JavaScript is a functional language, or that's not entire. It is a functional language and it can be used for other things. It's not just functional, but in terms of its paradigm, the word function is there because they're like first class. Right? Use the hell out of them, and you can even pass them around. Not just define and call, but define, pass around a bunch of times, and then call if you want. And you might be going like, what's the point of that? And we'll get to that, right? But it's an important attribute to understand. Does this mean I can do this? Just finishing up here. Just for our notes' sake, right? Because I'll be sending out these as notes. As you guys have gotten notes with the code in it, right? You like that? It's pretty cool, right? Yeah. Try to do the recordings too, but not always successful at that. Okay. So what if I do this? Can I do that? If I can pass greet around to a function, can I also assign it to another variable? Seems like it, because when you pass it into a function, you are kind of assigning it to a variable, aren't you? You're assigning it to a local parameter that function takes, a local variable. Agreed? Just like I did right here with name. And so greet does get assigned within console log somewhere, probably, right? And therefore, I'm assigning it myself here to something else. That should be legit in this language. And then I'm essentially saying, well, say hello is the function, so should I be able to call it? Yeah, should be able to call it. This should work. So my output I expect to see is first this same blue output that I saw before, because that's the previous line. I haven't commented it out. And then I expect to see hello KV. Exactly, nailed it. Yeah, so let's see that. Right? Sweet. Proving that point again, that functions are values. So what happens if I do this? And try to output, without calling say hello, I am outputting against the reference to say hello. What do you expect to see? It'll say function colon, right? I think we agree on that because I'm not calling the function. I'm referencing it. Now the question is, what will it say after the colon? It could be greet or it could be say hello. Both will be good guesses. So now it's just a matter of what's your guess? You're guessing greet? Say hello? Who knows? Let's find out. We learned that it says greet. What does that tell us? We learned something indirectly here, hopefully. It's passing the reference. Did it create two different functions here, or is there still just one function? Still one function. Right? So it seems like the second one, say hello, is a reference to greet. There's another thing that we've indirectly learned that's a little bit more obscure. Not that important either. It's a bit advanced. That the function has a name and that the first time you assign it to a variable, it steals that variable's name. Because this function technically has no name. You remember, you might have seen this in the prep course. We try to stay away from the syntax. And by the way, it's not bad. It's just some people actually say you do all your functions this way. Some people say do all your functions the other way. The JavaScript community is kind of confusing, to be honest. There's like too many different opinions. And there's not one right way to write JavaScript. And we're getting closer to that, but we're still not there. And so some people write functions this way. I'm just using 2 because I don't want to collide the name. Right? Like this is, and this the only reason this is complaining is because the ESLint here is programmed to complain because it wants us to at least be consistent. But another company might say, give errors on this syntax and let you do this syntax, right? Again, it's a style convention thing. But anyway, in JavaScript, this is a function, and this function has a name. It is not unnamed or anonymous. It is a valid, legit named function. This function is actually anonymous, but as soon as it's created, it goes from anonymous, and this happened as a change in JavaScript. It wasn't always the case. It goes from anonymous to named, and it grabs the name of the first variable that is assigned. It's kind of like a cheat that JavaScript implemented later on, right? So maybe 5-10 years ago, the correct answer was this is an anonymous function. Now it's technically, as of line 11, it's not an anonymous function. It gets the name, right? Sorry if I spoke too fast there. Tell me to slow down or ask questions. Go ahead. No, not there yet, but we'll try and get to it in this lecture. Not super important right now. Yeah. Arrow notation was asked about. I'll try and get to it. But it's like in my mind, it's like stretch for this lecture. And I forgot to say at the beginning that sometimes I will use questions to either curb questions or whatever. Please don't be offended. It's just me trying to stay on track. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I threw the word out, anonymous functions, and defined it all at the same time without really going into it. Because honestly, there's nothing more to them. It's just a function with no name. That's an anonymous function. And this is, one could argue an anonymous function. However, when I check its name, it says greet, as we saw in the output. Exactly. Yeah. Yes, you can. So the question is, can you define a function without giving it a name? Because here it seems to grab the default name. The answer is yes. Not super important how. Honestly, you end up doing it whether you like it or not. So we'll get to that, if that's cool. So later on in this lecture, I don't mean we'll get to it like weeks later. I mean, in this lecture, we'll get to it, if that's okay. Yeah. So, but great question. How are we doing in terms of attention? Am I going okay? Am I losing you? No? Again, no judgment. I zone out a lot, okay? All right, so we're not defining functions this way, even though one of the nice things there is that it's named right away, right? This thing, I hate this thing. I think we've talked about that subject enough. Yeah, we're feeling good about that? We don't know why we're passing these functions around, like what's the point, but we know that we can. Yeah? Okay, so that's kind of a review. You were already doing this without realizing it. You know, you just didn't do these experiments, assign the same function to another variable, right? Print out what it looks like when you just call the function by its name and don't actually call the function, like with parentheses. You didn't do those experiments. That's okay. Start doing them, though, those kind of things. Don't just follow the tutorials line by line, right? Or the readings, right? All right, we talked about that enough. What's next? So we talked about this, functions as values, right? All good, done. How are we with time? 10:45. So need to speed it up a little bit. Objects review. So here I'm going to switch gears a little bit, talk about objects, mainly because I know that yesterday is a heavy day. Who agrees that yesterday was a freaking crazy day? Right? Like Wednesdays of week 1 is usually when students go, oh, so I do have to stay here till 9. I see what that was about. Oh, and I will start to feel impossible. I see. Oh, and I won't have everything done. And I'll feel shit about that. I get it. I'll start to have kind of panicky feelings. I get it. Yeah, get used to that feeling, by the way. It's not just a Wednesday thing. You'll always feel slightly behind. Most of you. Right? There is stretch for those who don't. But I'll tell you, 99% of our students will not get the core work done every day. If I just took every single day and I said, let's look at every single student, very few of them, if any, are like, I got everything done every day in terms of core. Like forgetting even stretch. So just Yeah, get used to that feeling. It's the feeling of a developer on the job. You estimate something, you're like, this will take 2 hours, and then 2 weeks later, you're like, yeah, I'm done. At my first job, because I was pretty junior as a Rails dev, they would call me 2 weeks Verani, because I would always say I would always estimate things as like maximum 2 weeks, and it would take me way longer. Sometimes it would be like months later. And then they were just like, making fun of me to like get me to think about estimation better. By the way, one of the hardest things to do as a good dev, estimating. Oh my God, so hard. Still not good at it. Still not good at it. Anyway, we're going to switch gears, and here's me estimating how long this will take, but we'll see. We're going to do a little bit of review on objects. And actually, we're not going to talk about objects alone. I'm going to talk about something that I don't think this is used as a term, EDD. I don't think you've come across it. It's error-driven development. So again, speaking to that theme of errors and using them to your advantage, I specifically have a process in terms of how I use errors. And actually use them to drive my development process. So I drive my development process through errors, hence error-driven development. And I'm going to try and employ it because, again, lectures are about approach, right? Not just about topics like objects. So yes, we're going to cover objects, but I'm also going to throw in EDD there, hence the 30-minute estimate. Cool? So here's what I have in mind. We're going to do a challenge, as in a kata or a problem that we're going to solve. And I don't think you've seen it so far. It's basically like a cipher. So take a string or a series of characters and encode them. To make them secret or something. In this case, we're not going to make them secret. We're going to make them leet speak. Where sometimes you see like gamers talk like leet speak, where like leet is like 1337. Right? You know what I'm talking about right there? Leet. Right? Yeah, leet AF, exactly. So things like O become like 0, right? L becomes 1, hence the 1 here. And by the way, leet, for those of you who don't know, is like meme is that a meme? I don't know. Internet speak for elite, right? So not everyone is expected to know this. Don't feel bad if you don't know. Maybe feel good if you don't know. I don't know. E's become 3s because they're backwards. T's become 7s because why the hell not? Right? And so on. I don't know. We'll come up with these rules. We don't have to do all of them. So we're going to write a function that takes in an array of characters. We could do a string, but I kept it simple with array. Array of characters, so single letter elements in the array. And I'm going to implement it so that what it returns is another array of letters, but those letters have been encoded. So some letters will have been converted to those numbers that we see. Is that okay? How do I start? And this is a trick question. I'll tell you right off the bat. How do I start? What is the first line of code that I write? And this is, again, speaking to EDD. So I already given you more of a hint than I do most cohorts. Yeah. Defining a function wouldn't result in an error. Calling the function would result in an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cause an error by calling the function. I'm going to say, I don't know, what's the function called? Greet? Leet speak, maybe? Right? And instead of defining it, I'm going to call it with array, right? Now, my code editor is giving me some hints, but they don't always, and you might not have that configured. I hope you don't have it configured, in fact, because it kind of spoils you a little bit. You don't want to develop those bad habits early. But anyway, what happens when I run this? And the next step is to have a hypothesis about what the error will be. So what will the error be? Function not defined. Yeah, something like that. This function, reference error, leet speak is not defined. And this is helping me get acquainted with the language, right? If it's a language that I've never done this with, the error might be slightly different, and it's nice to know what that error looks like, so when I encounter it accidentally, I don't need to put too much cognitive effort in terms of understanding what's going on. So it's a reference error, referencing something that does not exist. It doesn't even know that it's a function. It's just like it's not defined, right? Now my next step is to solve that error, to write code, minimal code, to fix that error. What's the smallest amount of code I could write to fix that error? Now, I'm going to do this in the most dogmatic way, just to prove a point, and you could try that, and then eventually you start coming up with more efficient ways, right? So what is the least amount of code that I can write to get rid of that error? Which doesn't mean get rid of all errors, it just means get rid of that error. A console log won't really make that error go away because it still needs to evaluate this in the console log, right? When I have this, so if I just add console log here, this is a good talking point. If I do console log here, this is what I think you were saying, this needs to be evaluated still, and it will still fail here before it even gets to the console log. Right? I mean, just tell me what code to write as the minimum amount of code, and it's not console log, to make that error go away. Yeah, you can use const, but yeah, we could do let as well. That's it, exactly. That is it. That's the least amount of code to make that error go away. What do we expect will happen next? It's not a function. What is the value of it? Undefined. So we're trying to call, we're literally doing this. Right? Is this useful? I think this is useful. Because now what we're going to see is, what does that error look like? And also, are we right about that assumption? Notice we're supposed to be talking about objects. I'm not there yet, right? Like, that's why my lectures tend to be a little bit longer. Apologize. Oh, shit. Already ran it. So, yes, my assumption would have been, it wouldn't have been the same error. And it would be something like you're trying to call undefined, or the thing you're calling is not defined. Lead speak is not a function. So it's a type error. Right? So I wonder, like, type error, it's not saying anything about not defined or undefined. So if I set this to 5, will it be the same error then? Sounds like it, right? I'm not even sure myself. Yeah. Interesting. Cool. Okay, so I have that error. Now I guess I have to define it to be a function in order to make the error go away. Right? Not all errors go away, but make this error go away, because it's saying, hey, this is not a function. Okay, I'll make it a function. That's the minimum amount of code that I can write to make it a function. I know it's not the right code in terms of my solution, but it is going to make that error go away. Agreed? Okay, what do I expect to happen now when I run this? What error do I expect to see? Function is defined. So this error here, lead speak is not a function, should go away and be replaced with what? Nothing. Yeah, I was intentionally phrasing the question to be a trick. There is no error now. Right? Tricked you, at least some of you. This is a valid piece of JavaScript somehow. I don't know, JavaScript decides that's valid. Most languages are like, what are you doing? Right? Because what's this function returning? Nothing. What's this function taking in? Nothing. But we're calling it with something? Like, what is even happening? But apparently valid. So no error, legit. Again, this is JavaScript specific answer. Legit piece of code. No output because there's no console log anywhere. Yeah.
So in that, are you just like making an empty container and throwing something in it?
Yeah. 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 I see functions as, I don't see functions as containers. I see functions as, but this is a good point though. I like that word, because what do you see functions as in like the real world? Like, what's the analogy you like to use? Yeah, it could be like a microwave function, like you press a button. Yeah, that's an analogy that you could use. Yeah. So it does something. It's a task doer, and it takes an input and does the task and then returns you the results. I see it as a person often. When I see functions, I'm seeing people. Not with personalities and weird, like, you know, things like that. Like, it doesn't get like dark or anything. But like, I consider, like, in terms of good software architecture, I'm like, is this person doing too much? Am I asking them to do too much? Are they responsible for too many things? It's the same question you would ask in a org chart at a company, right? Like when you're talking about staffing. Right? So a lot of software development has parallels with real world architecture of anything. You know, is this pillar on the bridge, like, is this thing bearing too much weight, right? Like, these things have functions, right? or they could be seen as functions. Anyway, I digress. So we've gotten rid of all the errors, but we still have a problem. So we're still technically in EDD mode, error-driven development mode, which is I want to solve my next error. My error is that I'm not seeing anything. Right? So maybe what's something I could do in here? Maybe I have a little bit of a branch in the road, like I could decide to do one thing or the other. But what is some of the things I could do, minimum amounts of code, to work iteratively towards the solution? Take an input on the function, yeah, but the problem with taking an input here is I will see no change when I run the code. So by itself, it doesn't really, I don't know if I did the right thing, or I don't know if it has any consequence. So again, being dogmatic, I'm not arguing that you wouldn't do that as a next step logically, but if I'm being really dogmatic about it. Console log something, sorry, what else? Return something. Now if I return something, will I see anything? I won't see anything because I'm not console logging. Right, so maybe my next step is, maybe I'll just console log the return value of the function, and then I have an expectation that something will change based on that. Is this valuable as steps? Why is this valuable? Tell me why this is a good way to work. Yeah, clear understanding of how to structure a function, sure. I'm looking for other things, yeah? Yeah, but why is incremental development using errors first? Why is that a good approach? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No. Yeah, and also at a larger level, I kind of feel more in control. I'm not writing a bunch of lines and being like, I hope this works. I have no idea. Let me use the computer to tell me if this works or not. You guys ever be like, I bet you most of you do this. First of all, there's two things that you do that I probably don't like. One, whether you admit it to yourself or to me or not, you are nervous about hitting enter most of the time to run your code. Because, why are you nervous? And this is point 2, you are afraid of failure, and you're afraid of errors, which kind of map to failure for some reason. First of all, we shouldn't be afraid of failure, as we've talked about on day 1. But second, unrelated or somewhat related, we shouldn't be afraid of errors because errors are not failure. This is what EDD is about. EDD's errors are success, right? As long as you're in control, or as much as you can be. So now I've taken something that I associate with failure, and I'm saying actually that is success. While doing that, I'm also getting familiar with how the language speaks to me in terms of errors. So it's two birds. This is why this is good tricks. Not just for learning the first language, but literally this is how I code. I just skip some of these EDD steps, but I'm still causing errors first. Not everybody does this. I'm not saying all developers do this. I'm saying my type of developer does this. Right? Okay. So yeah, let's go a little bit faster, just given time and all that. We said we're going to console log. So I'm going to just console log. Now I can console log, right? Because I'm just seeing what the hell's coming back here. I'm not able to see anything. And what do I expect? Because I know the function's returning undefined by default, because it doesn't have a return statement, I expect to see undefined. And that is my error state, because that's not what I want to get to, right? So that's still technically an error in my words. So now I wanted to not return undefined. I wanted to return what I want to see, which is I want to see an array. I mean, first of all, I could just say return 5 or something, and I expect to not see undefined anymore. But more importantly, I want to see an array of letters like hello. By the way, H becomes 4, I believe, in LeetSpeak. Like, what the hell just happened? All of these just became numbers given LeetSpeak. Right? That's hello. Because apparently 4 looks like an H, depending on how you write your H's. So that's what I expect to see, right? Oh, my program actually works. It's taking a string as an array and returning LeetSpeak. I didn't actually solve the problem, but I solved one use case, right? Now, of course, if I was to create other scenarios, my function will keep returning the same values. Therefore, I would show that my function doesn't actually work. But in this scenario, in this one test case, it works. And what that tells me, by the way, is that one test case is never enough, because you can just game that test case. How many people here did the 21-day code challenge? Just one? No one else? It's disappointing. Disappointed in all y'all. If I had some prize to give you, I would. I don't have any. Yeah. But anyway, in those you had daily challenges that you had to define a function that does X. And if you just hard-coded it, it wouldn't work because we had tests to make sure that, like, does it work with this value? Does it work with that value? Right? Because you could just cheat like this. Where do we go from here? What do I do? This is not what I want. First of all, it needs to take in some data, right? And then maybe I'm going to work incrementally here, not really causing an error. I'm going to kind of try a different tactic. Just want to make sure I'm in control. So I'm going to take in an argument. Let's call that the something vague like input is terrible, right? Like everything is an input. Like what? So what's a good name for this? That's a type, right? Ideally, it should just array of what? Because a lot of things will be arrays. You could say array of, but you could also make it just a plural name so that it could be characters. Like that gives me a little bit more, letters, those kind of things, right? The plural kind of implies that it's a collection, an array. You could say array of characters if you want to be more verbose. And then I'll just console log it. Like literally, that's usually, not always, but like I just want to feel like I know what I'm doing here. Like, is this coming in? I think so. Boom. Right? And then what's this undefined coming from? It's coming from this console log trying to output, right? Because the function is still returning undefined. Are you guys still with me? Yeah. Okay. So now I want to go through each character in the array and decide on what the mapping of that should be, right? It shouldn't be an H, it should be a 4, and so on, right? So I would do, yeah. So here on line 13, the question is why undefined, right? That's what you're asking? Oh, sorry, no, the first output is coming from here, which is correct. So it is outputting the array. Because there's two console logs here in this code. And this one is the old one that we wrote that was undefined before as well. Yeah, yeah. No worries. No, I'm just going too fast maybe. So yeah, I need to loop through these, right? So I could do something like for. How do you guys do for loops? Could be C style. Could we do a better for loop than C style? For arrays. In is technically more for objects. Although I would argue even with objects I use for of, I just use object.keys. But anyway, for const character or char of characters, like that seems to read well, right? And then instead of trying to like do other logic, I just want to be done with this for loop. So the simple thing I could just do in this for loop, I could leave it empty, but I could just to see what's happening, I'm just going to console log char. Again, incremental development. Right? And so when I run this, I expect to see this output still, which is this line, and then I expect to see in separate lines HELLO, and then I still expect to see the undefined at the end there. Notice how I always talk about what I expect to see. This is another habit that I bet you don't have yet, because you're relying on the computer nervously to give you an error. Try not to do that. Right? Okay. Next, I need to be able to do what? Convert that character over to its non-character form, like its leet speak form. You could argue, well, Kiwi, you're supposed to return an array at the end, so why aren't you talking about that? Well, I'm thinking small steps, and there isn't one right path here, but I'm thinking, yeah, I need to return an array, but right now I have one character at a time. Why don't I try and mutate that, right, into its new form? So const leet character is going to be some value, right? Like maybe if it's H, it should become a 4, right? And so maybe when I console log, I should just console log, just for debugging purposes for me, I should console log that char becomes leet char. See what I did there? I'm not actually working on the solution. I'm working on setting up so that I can debug well here. See what I did? And when I run this, I expect to see each character being output on a separate line, but then an arrow right after it, as well as 4 right after it. Do you see what I'm doing? Even though it's not the solution. It's not the solution, but it's setting me up for the solution. Again, that incremental development. Now you might be going, KV, you talked about error-driven development. Where are your errors now? You could argue that these are errors. They're just not errors from JavaScript. They're just, at each point I'm not at the solution yet, and I'm thinking about what's next. And how do I get closer to the solution, not fully to the solution? So it's still incremental development. Sometimes I can't get exactly errors all the time, and so I consider other things as errors or problems that I need to fix. Right? So now the question is, this is static. This is a problem. This is my error. How do I get this to actually be not just 4 all the time? I have 1 hand go up. I hopefully will see more hands. 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've talked a little bit. Why don't you in the back in the corner? Yep. Leave it empty. So like this. But then I have a similar problem, which is instead of 4, it's going to be empty. But are you saying that leave it empty and then next step? Okay, then what's your next step? Because I was hoping for that next step as well. Sorry? An if statement is not a bad answer. So leave it empty. Actually, I would leave it as a default as the original character, because in some cases we want to switch it, in some cases we want to leave it, right? And then you'd have an if statement, like if lead, and then if I'm going to change it, it shouldn't be a const, it should be a let, right? Because I might change it. And if a const you cannot change, right? So if char is an h, then make char equal to a 4, right? Oh, sorry, not char, lead char, because char is the original. I want to just change the lead char, because that's the new one for that char. Agreed? So now, only the h, so I'm going to have a behavior change here. I don't need to write more code, because already I can see a change here in that it should say, what should it say? Since you give the answer, what will I see here instead? Exactly. And then for the other ones? Original. Exactly. Exactly. Do we get that? Are we on the same page? Sweet. Progress, right? And then we'd have else ifs, right? What am I doing? There we go, right? And so on. And I can continue with this on, and I'm essentially close to my solution. The only problem is my function is not returning an array, right? And so we should just do that next, maybe? It's console logging. The function is supposed to return a version of the array. So how do I do that? Maybe start with an empty array and then keep pushing to it. So here, I'm going to say, this console log should start, my error is that this console log currently is doing undefined. And I'm going to get rid of the console log here and see that actually I'm not getting back the original, right? I'm going to get rid of this console log here as well. So I'm just getting back undefined. That's my problem. And I need this to not get back undefined, but to get back the array. So here, I'm going to start with an error. Remember? Error-driven development. First, I'm going to try and return the array. Return final. I'm not going to say final array. Again, that's too vague. Please don't use names like that. A lot of things are arrays. It could be like leet characters or something like that, right? For consistency. And I expect that to error out saying leet characters is not defined. Then I'm going to define it. And then I expect it to return an empty array, because that's all it is. And then I'm going to say, woo, I need to actually like take the lead char and push, probably after it's been fully defined, like I know what it actually is going to be. I need to take that and push it into the array, append it into the array, right? And now what I'm going to end up with as a result of looping that over is I'm going to end up with an array of those lead characters. Right? So far, so good. We haven't talked about objects yet. So how can I make this better with objects? Already gave you a little bit of a hint there. There's a refactor that we could do with objects here. Yep. Yeah, exactly. Because objects are mappings, mapping a key to a value. And what we're doing here is mapping. We can see that H maps to a 4, E maps to a 3. When we use the word mapping there, we know that objects can be a good solution. That's not the only thing objects are good for, but this is a good use of objects in JavaScript. And this is just the name I've decided to call it, leet mappings. I'm going to say, not that 4 maps to, that's the Ruby syntax, by the way, not that 4 maps to H, or maybe I'm doing backward too, but actually that H maps to 4. Because I'm always going to look up by key, not by value. Usually if I'm using objects to my advantage. That's the advantage that objects give me, is I can quickly look up by key. Quickly looking up by value, can't do it. Need to loop through the whole thing. Not really worth it, right? So I want to find an H and then be like, what's the new value for that? It's going to be a 4. So I'm using it as that, right? Same thing with, I'm just going to do a few of them because we don't need to do all of them. Now you could argue, what's a thing I'm not thinking about? Capital letters. So you could argue, well, don't you need capital H as well? Maybe you decide not to replace capital H. I don't know. That's just an arbitrary decision. Who cares? We're getting the point here, right? And now actually I made a mistake. I should have started using leet mappings, had an error, and then defined leet mappings. Right? So but you know what? I'm kind of speeding up a little bit. But I should have done that, and then I should have just started with 1, made sure that was working, and then go on the others. Again, to have full control and not write as much without having to debug. So here, instead of the if statement, we are now saying leet character is character, or leet character is going to become leet mappings, and then we're going to pass in to leet mappings, but it's not a function. So I'm not going to use parentheses to pass in the character. If I did that, what would happen? Type error. Function is not a leet mappings is not a function. And I intentionally do that just to kind of make sure that I'm with it. Instead, I'm going to use square brackets to pass that in. Now you might ask, there's also dot notation. So will this work? Because it's a variable, this is literally going to look for char. And it's not going to find anything, so it'll basically give us back undefined every time. So we don't want to look for literally char. We want to look for the thing that char contains. Right? And therefore, we have to use square brackets there. That's why this notation exists. And now we should be closer to our solution because we're calling leet mappings for each character. And leet mappings gives us the value for H, which will be 4. And so this will become a 4, and we'll push 4 into the array. Is everybody with me on this, or do we want to recap a little bit? Yeah, question? Yeah, specific. No, leet mappings.h is legit. And by the way, .char is not going to be an error either. It's going to be undefined. In another language, it might be. Here, it's not going to be undefined. It's going to be, okay, it's going to be 4, right? So here, what I expect to see is it's good. It's working, right? How do I know it's working? Let's just take these out. and just causing an error now to make sure that I'm with it again and I'm not dreaming things up, and just being like, what if this is empty, or what if it only has H mapping and nothing else? What do we expect will happen here? What do you think it'll say? Or what do you think it'll return in terms of the array? Yeah, exactly. The H, undefined, 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 right? Because it couldn't find the others. But that's not what we want. We want H, and if they're not defined, we want it to be HELLO. So I have a bug. Because what if the string has other letters that are not part of the leet speak? You know, letters like K, letters like V, right? People like me in that array. I don't know where I'm going with that joke. So how do I do that? Well, I can't always assume that this will come back with something defined. So I have to like see, does it come back with something defined? So I'm doing a truth evaluation there. This is a little bit, not advanced, but a review of ternary operators. Does it come with something? Is it defined? Is it truthy? If so, go ahead and use it. Otherwise, use the original value. And this is a good use case for a ternary where no matter what the outcome is, you want to assign the outcome to the same variable. So that same variable equals if statement. If statement in a ternary operator. Is it truthy? Yes, that means I got something back. Go ahead and use it. Otherwise, use the original char. H or 4ELLO, right? And then now we can even define our mapping much more easier. So another benefit of using objects here is I don't have to keep adding if statements. I don't have 20 if statements or whatever, 10 if statements. And if I decide to change the algorithm, I can just add or remove keys and values to the object. Much easier to tweak. So with 11:18 here, we're going to take a break. Think about questions. It's okay to come back and ask questions about this. Instead of taking a 10-minute break, because I went overtime, I'm only giving you a 5-minute break. So you're all punished somehow by me going overtime. I don't know why. So please 5-minute bio break, and let's re-adjourn in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, we're back. And this is where we left off, where we used, instead of if statements, we used objects to look up our mappings. Any questions about this before we move back to functions and talk about callbacks? Yep, go ahead. Is it specifically, so the question is about char and looping, is it specifically this type of loop that you're not familiar with? Okay. So what this loop is essentially doing is, it's like a C-style loop, but just shorter and more concise and no counting. Like, the C-style loop counts, but I don't want the number. I want the char. But the C-style loop would be something like this. Right? Isn't this your standard, I want to loop from the beginning to the end? And then you really want the character, so you'd say, let char equal, or const char equal. What are you going to do? Characters at I, right? Because I want the thing at that index. This is like a very common pattern. But why write so much code to really just get the character? Why not do a shorter, just get the character for each from beginning to end? So it's the same as that, except less code. And I don't have access to I here. So that's also less powerful. Right? And, I can't do like step, to do every other one, or do every third one, or go backward, right? Like I can't control those kind of things. These are more powerful. This is simpler for the use case of going from the beginning to the end, which is what you do most of the time. Yep. Ask your question again. You know what? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe I did and I've forgotten because I haven't done it in a while. But like the question is, how do you get? It'd be nice if for of also gave you the index. I would have to Google that. Let's Google it. For of with index JavaScript. This is also a good skill, by the way. Some people forget to put JavaScript in there and they're getting other languages. And then also how to scan the results. How to get an index of an iteration in the for of loop in JavaScript. Yeah, I thought that's what it would be. You actually have to do dot entries. I think it's in the curriculum, actually. I can't remember, because I remember looking this up when I was writing some of the week 1 content that you guys are going through. And I do remember coming across this now, where if you do dot entries on the array, then that returns a different kind of thing that you can loop over, where you get the array, and the array includes both the number and the thing. And then you can just use those like that. No, not the key and the value, because this is going over an array. So it would be the 0A, 1B, 2C. So it's the index and the value, which is what the question was. How do I get the index and the value? Because with the original C style for loop, I can get I, which is the index, and I can get C, which is the character, with a little bit of code. Well, how do I do that with this type of loop? You would do dot entries, and then you would have I and char, and then you can have the index and the character. Yep, question? I would say this is still, to me, this still reads better. I don't know which, but I would argue that's probably more performant. And this is probably slightly slower because I'm doing this dot entries thing. So if I really care about like microseconds, then maybe I'd do the original C style way. But if I care about elegance and stuff and more ES6 style, then I would do it this way. So it really depends. No, that's it. And then I can console log I, and I will be going from 0 upwards. Yeah. It's okay if you're not clear on it. Not a huge thing right now. I don't even use this most of the time. I don't have a problem example made up right off the top of my head, but let's say you did, right? There are some. I'm intentionally thinking about the next thing I want to lecture. Okay, so let's move on. Next thing we're going to talk about after objects review, which was a slight review on objects, but really I cheated. I talked more about error-driven development, dev approach, and a little bit about objects, right? Hopefully that was okay, though. Just taking that approach will make you more comfortable with objects, because you're probably not comfortable with objects. Oh, and on that note, we introduced objects yesterday. It doesn't mean that you have to master objects yesterday. Some students have this thought that, like, I'm not comfortable with objects. I'm moving on already. Like, I'm not ready. And yes, if you're not done some of the core exercises from yesterday, consider doing them before moving on. And on that note, I have something to say, specifically on yesterday. So on yesterday's content, if you are not done this stuff here, which most of you aren't, I don't think. These are core, but if you're like, oh my gosh, it'll take me the rest of today to really get yesterday's stuff done, these two last ones, I'm okay with you skipping for now and coming back to them on Friday or the weekend. It won't burn you too much, or at all. This won't burn you at all if you skip these. If you skip this, it might hurt you. Is that cool? So that's a little bonus cheat right there in terms of not feeling too far behind. And that's specific to yesterday's content because I know the content really well. Cool? Okay. Let's move on. So now we're going to talk about callbacks. And this is where we have more files. So we talked about objects challenge. We did that. I'll send you that code, of course. Now let's talk about function passing. So remember we talked about functions before objects, right? And functions can be passed around. Like we did greet and then say hello. So yeah, here's a function. It returns 6, whatever. Who cares? It's a function. It can be passed around, which means we know that we can assign it to other variables, but we can also pass it to other functions, right? As we did, we passed in the word greet. Right here, I passed it to another function. What was that other function? Console log, right? So I'm going to do the same thing, except this time I'm going to pass it to one of my functions, not console log. Not exactly the most creative example, but it takes in a function. Now I'm going to call another func, not working incrementally here, but just to prove a point. And what am I going to pass in? A function, f in this case. Not f like this, because f returns a number, but f itself is a function. Now, given that there's nothing in here, I'm not going to see much happen at all. There's no console logging at all. So maybe the last step I'll do before I run this piece of code is also log what was just passed into it. Awkward pause. Let that soak in a little bit. So what's happening here in terms of logic? Well, this is just a function that's defined. We don't have to look at what's inside it until it's called. Here it's called. In order to understand what's passed in, I have to understand what f is. F is this function here. Okay, so really what I'm seeing in my mind is I'm seeing this. I know it looks kind of confusing, but it's essentially the function is being passed in as the only one and only argument into another func. Right? So in my mind, I'm seeing that thing copy-pasted inside of these parentheses. But really, that's f. And that means that func is that function, which means it's a function. I can call it, I can console log it, whatever I want to do. So I should see, what should I see? It'll be in blue, right? With square brackets, and it will say function colon, and what will be the name of the function? F, correct, I think. Exactly. Because the original name was F. I'm not invoking it. I'm not getting back 6 or whatever. I am just seeing what the value is, which is the function itself. The function itself is the value. It is not making a copy of that function. If I were to run this in Python Tutor, for example, have you already used Python Tutor in lecture? Yeah, or JavaScript Tutor? Yeah, so if I just copy paste this, right, and run it in Python Tutor /JavaScript. How do you get to JavaScript right here? Nope, that's Java. That looks ugly. JavaScript Tutor. Right there, and I visualize, I will see F becomes f becomes the function, and this container here, f, points to a function. So two things get allocated in the first line of code. The variable f allocates piece of memory right here. But what is the value of that piece of memory? It is not a number like 6 or 5. It is a longer number that points to another piece of memory where a function is allocated. So this gets allocated, takes up memory, then this gets allocated and points to that thing. Okay. And then next line will not run the function, but just define another func, right? That's another func, like it's literally a new function. So that's going to define the same thing, another function, does something different. And then here we're going to actually call another func and pass in f. So now we're going to be inside of another func. And here the local variable func, too many funcs here. This local variable here is pointing to the original function f. Right? They're both pointing to the same function. A third function is not created. There's only two functions created here, f and another func. And f is passed into another func. So it's not copied, it's referenced. Okay. Do we understand what's happening here in terms of control flow? Can you read this code? Remember, I started this lecture with learning to read the code. Can you read this code in the same style? Right? Don't jump into the functions. Go to the point where the function is being called, which is line 11. And then at that point, you can start jumping around. Okay, what is f? F is line 3. That's being passed into line 11. And that means I'm jumping to line 8, where that another func that's being called is being actually running. Right? And okay, that's console logging func. Well, func is actually f. Cool. Right? Any questions about that? Okay, let's start using this stuff. So let's say I want to go through an array of things. In this case, they're an array of names, instructor names in this case. And I'm going to get rid of, sorry, whoops. Whoa, where am I? I'm going to get rid of these comments here. In order to go through these names and print them out, I'm going to write a function to do that. Okay? And the function is going to look something like this. I'm going to go faster here. And maybe I shouldn't give it the same in local variable name as the one that's outside, so I'm going to say items. This function just does print. It's called print items or print each. Okay? And what is this going to do? It's going to go through each one and it's going to print them. So again, like we did before, for const item of items. I'm not doing error-driven development here, mainly because I've shown you that already, and I need to go faster here, right? Otherwise, I would. Console log item. Did I miss something? And then I'm going to, of course, call that function. Or not, I don't need to console log because it's happening inside. I'm just going to call that function. Do we agree this will work? Unless there's a typo or something? Yeah. So let's go ahead and run that. Nothing happened. What did I screw up? Oh, no, this is file 8. Oh, I screwed up. I should have been in that file, but anyway, I'll just rename it. Callback need, sure, callback, and then this one is 8 callback intro. All right, so here we are. So I'm basically going through each of these things and I'm consoling them to the screen, right? This function is responsible for doing what? What is its responsibility if it was a person? looping through each item, and printing each item to the screen. And as soon as you see an AND, that should raise an eyebrow, go, oh, this function has more responsibility than one, which is a sign of a function that should ideally be split into two or more. Right? This whole idea of single responsibility principle, try to have functions that just have one responsibility. So how can I split it up? To just do one of those things and then maybe delegate the other thing to another function. I would need another function that does one of these two things, right? Maybe I take this part and move it to another function. Right? Seems kind of trivial, but maybe the printing is like supposed to be more advanced. You know, it's supposed to have formatting or something. This one's not showing that, but it seems arbitrary to move something like a console log into a function, but just pretend that that's a more advanced console log. Okay. So here now, it's going to be print item. And maybe, you know, I'll just say item colon. That's my more advanced printing. But essentially what I've done is instead of calling console log in the main function, I am actually delegating that work. Right? This feels a little bit better, doesn't it? Even though it's more code, it's separation of responsibility. Right? If I just want to change how it's formatted when it's printed, I do that here. If I want to change what I'm looping through, I do that here. And these can now be multi-purpose, one could argue. Now, this is still not great. Can anybody guess why this is still not great? This is a little bit more of an advanced question. What can we do that's better? Is another way to ask that. What's still a problem with the main function print each? Yes, that's one problem. It's not returning a value. But that's not what I was focusing on. That's fair, but in this example, we're not going to solve that one. Is this function actually doing just one thing? Would you change its name from print each to something else? But it's not just looping, right? It's looping and then it's delegating to print each, print item. So it's not exactly just doing one thing. It still knows that it has to print the thing. It just moved that responsibility to some other person or function. So it's still, ultimately, when you call this function, two things happen. It loops through the things, and then it prints the things as it loops through them. Right? So you could argue that while you've separated the responsibility, it's still accountable for doing both things. Not only that, there's another problem, which is, what if I wanted to loop through all the items in the same way, but then instead of printing them, I wanted to do something else with them, add it to another array or something like that, right? Now I would have to copy this and still do the loop, right? And something else would happen, do whatever with item. Agreed? You know, maybe you collect each or something like that, or you calculate something. So that would be something like this. But there's repetition here. I'm doing looping in both of those things. Agreed? No, but what if I want to do them like in different parts of my app? Right? I can't just do collecting and printing in this. Like there's separate points in my app that I want to print in one side. You know, I want to go through them and print them all. And in another case, I want to go through and do something else with them. Yep. Yeah, ideally I should be able to make a looping function that doesn't care if you're printing or collecting or doing something else. Keep it generic. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, could you add like a destination or target function for where to send for the function?
That's exactly where we're going, right? So you're onto the solution here, which is great. So just to recap, the solution is going to be a combination of what you just said. Create a function that's more generic, that all it does is looping and doesn't know of the existence of a print item or collect item. It's not tied to it. Because right now, this is tied to print item. If I just take this code and move it into another file, it will fail to run because it needs print item to come with it. It's coupled. So that's a bad attribute. This function is coupled with another function. Exactly. So it's still kind of accountable for both things, right? I want to make it accountable for just the one thing, right? So, yeah, I'm just going to write down the problem. The problem we see here, we start seeing here, is that A, both functions are looping, so this is repetitive. B, both functions need the existence of the other named functions, like print item, collect item, and so on. Right? This one needs collect item, this one needs print item. They're not decoupled. And what else? Is there a C? Another problem? Both functions are looping, which is repetitive code. And both functions need the existence of the other named function. Yeah, that's about right. Oh, yeah, and both functions are technically still responsible for both things, right? They are still doing something very specific, which is looping and printing, for example, instead of just one thing, example looping. So this is where what we're going to do instead is have a generic function like a for each, which all it's responsible for is looping, and it doesn't know the existence of any other function names. So instead of saying, why don't you assume that print function exists, or print item exists, we say, why assume? I'll pass you the name of the function. Because guess what? We already learned in the previous exercise, we can pass functions around. Right? And for each already exists. So we don't even have to build it. Items.forEach takes in a function. You don't even have to name the function. This is an anonymous function going right in, not named. Okay, this is the first and only argument to for each. And inside here, this function can console log the thing. So how many functions am I calling here? How many different functions are being called here? No. 2 different functions are being called. One that I've defined, which is the callback function. And then for each. So for each is taking in what? How many arguments? 1. And that argument is a function. It is not the items, because for each happens to be on the items itself. So we don't have to pass in the items, which is nice. It's a nice convenience. Because if it was like this, right? Then we'd have to pass in the items and the function. Right? Because it's not on the items. It's just by itself. But because it's items.forEach, I don't have to pass in the items. It has access to that. And you're probably going like, I don't understand what's happening here in terms of what's going to happen or why it's going to happen the way it's going to happen. So we're going to explain that. Don't worry. We're going to explain that by creating our own for each to understand how it works. Okay? In the remaining 10 minutes that we have. Now, by the way, files 10 and 11 are usually ones I don't get to, and that's because I tend to ramble or whatever. They're stretch. It's just more practice with callbacks. So it's okay if we don't get to that. So really we want to get to file 9. Or sorry, file 9. Okay, so anyway, this means I'm calling a function that takes in a function. Right? Let's run it. And before running it, I can tell you, whoops, that's not the file 8, which is a for each intro. And it will actually output all the items in the array in order. So it's an existing construct in JavaScript. It's been there since before for of, and it's a function that you can call on an array. So the array here is items, and I can call for each as a function on it, and the argument it takes is a function. Instead of defining that function, which I could previously, I decided to just pass it in as I declared it, but maybe this will make it easier for you to understand what's happening. Where I first I added to an array, added to a value called my function, and then I passed my function into for each. In both cases, the same thing's happening. I am passing in a function. In the previous case, it was just me being more lazy, typing out fewer characters, and not defining a variable while creating that function. This one's not anonymous. The first example was anonymous, but they both accomplish the exact same thing. Let's just make sure.
But I mean, just like if you look at the end.
Yeah. And so I'm just gonna have the anonymous version here. Anonymous, and it's defined in line, right? Without a variable. That's basically just taking the function and not assigning to a variable and just literally pasting it in here. Right? They do the same thing. Right? Now, I'm assuming if I said any questions, it would be like, well, how is this working? I don't understand. So let's do that next instead of asking that question. Let's define our own for each and try to implement this logic so we fully understand how for each is working in terms of control flow, if we don't yet. Instead of just doing for each, I propose that, because for each already exists, but for each backward doesn't exist. So let's implement for each backward. Same idea, but instead of going from the beginning to the end, we are going from the end to the beginning. Is that cool? I already got some data, right? And I want to implement this as a for each backward. This is going to be probably the hardest part of the lecture, and you're probably the most tired. So that kind of sucks in terms of, that. But let's try and see that through, if that's okay. So I'm going to start with a simple implementation without callbacks, without all this craziness, and just implement for each backward without all those new things that I just learned. And then I'm going to refactor it, change it up. Is that okay? So really, we're just going to have one function because we're just doing it simply, which is going to both print and loop because it's doing too much, but that's okay. We'll change it. Print each backward. Is that okay? And yes, I would do this in an EDD way, right? So I would first call it, and you should do it that way as well. And then you'll expect to see the error. Then you'll define it. And it will take in the items. So let's call these words here. And then here we can call them items. And let's just make sure that's working. Expect to see the words. Perfect. And then we want to loop through them backwards. So how do I do that? For of is not going to work. For of starts from the beginning. C style. Yeah, exactly. For let I equals not 0, because that'll be the beginning. Items.length, exactly. Length minus 1, exactly. Because if it's 3, the last index is 2. So we have to subtract 1 because it's 0-based indexing. I is not going to be less than the length because we're not increasing I, we're decreasing I. So while I is greater than or equal to 0, we want to keep going. We want to go until 0. And I minus minus or I minus equals 0 to go, minus equals 1 to go back by 1. Right? And then what am I going to do? Small steps. Just console log I. It's not the solution. I just want to make sure that's working correctly. I expect to see 2, 1, 0. Sweet. That's working. Now, I need to access the item using I. Agreed? Nothing magical here. And then I'm going to console log the item. I think I've achieved for each backward. Sorry, I think I've achieved print each backward. But I haven't achieved for each backward, which is a more generic for each. So that's what we're going to do. Sorry about the disturbance there. So in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to refactor this to use callbacks. Or we'll go a little bit over time. I apologize. You guys still with me or exhausted? Still? Mostly still with me. Okay, great. How do I refactor this? Well, again, I could have a function called print item. And then instead of it being called console log being called here, I just do print item. But we agreed that this is not, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not fully elegant because these two functions are still coupled. One knows about the other, it knows the name, it needs that function with that name. That kind of sucks. Because what we really want is for each backward, and we'll decide if we want to print or we want to do something else. Right? It's not always going to be printing. It could be something else that we want to do backward. And so, instead of calling print item, we will not assume that print item exists, but we will take in another function. Right? And instead of calling it callback, which I could, I'll call it something like do or like perform with item or something like that. Because this is a verb. This is an action. A function is do something, right? This is not a piece of data like 5 or a word. This is actually a behavior or a function. And so it's going to have it should be a verb like perform or do or something like that. And then I'm just going to say perform with item. So for each backward is now taking in 2 arguments. One is the data, the other is the behavior. Software is 2 things, data and behavior. Both can be passed into a function. Which means that the second argument that's being passed into print each backwards, now known as for each backward, is going to be print item. What did we accomplish by doing this? We have a function now that is only responsible for looping, and then it has no idea what you're doing with it. Just give it the function, and it doesn't care what that function does. It will do it. It's no longer print specific. So that's what we've accomplished. This function is no longer print specific. Yep. Exactly. That's the next step to prove that this actually works. Here I'm calling it for each backward, and what do I want to do with each? Print. What if I want to do something else? Maybe I want to collect. So I want to have let collection equals an empty array, right? And I want to say collection dot push the item, and the item's coming into the callback function here. So here I'm showing you an example where I'm using for each backward a second time, but this time I'm also being lazy and defining the second parameter right there instead of assigning it to a variable. This is called an anonymous function, right? And it's also inline, so it's an inline anonymous function. Who cares what it's called though? And I'm going to just console log collection out here just to make sure that I'm able to collect the things backward. Right? So the second use is not about printing, it's about collecting. And we should see the last argument, or the last output, is now the words backwards in their own array. Right? Maybe it's actually not about collecting all, it's about collecting only words that are greater than a certain length, right? Well, I could just do that here. If item.length is greater than 3, then we collect. Right? It could be a special filtering function. Only collect if this condition. Right? Yeah, I think this would work. I don't think there's any, because I'm assuming item is a string here, right? Only because it's one line, you can cheat. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you could. Yeah. Some people say don't do that, but I think we allow it in our school. We won't punish you, and JavaScript won't either. So here, I guess everything is over 30, over 3. So maybe we'll say over 5, and then we only get Lighthouse, right? So now I've used this. I'm continuing to use this for each backward for many different things. All right. It's reusability. And what I'm changing is just the function that I'm passing in and what it's doing, but not the whole thing. Okay, I know we're over time. It's 12:02, but it would be bad practice for me to just end it here, I think, and not do a quick recap. Okay, so just going back to that agenda file that I have, bear with me, or that notes file. What did we learn? Let's just quickly bullet point what we learned in this whole lecture. EDD is good. All right, error-driven development. Objects, what did we learn about objects, or what did we review about objects? We didn't loop through objects. Can be used for mapping, or are used for mapping key to value, KV in the house right there, which means we can use them to map letter H to 4 to implement leet speak. How do you spell speak? It's E-A-K, right? Was I doing E-E-K the entire time? Yeah. Sure. That was intentional. What else did we learn? Yeah, functions are values. You can even assign them to other variables and pass them into other functions. Oh, and yeah, we didn't really talk about this. I don't really like to get into it in lecture. We do talk about it in the notes for today. Functions are actually object values. So they're actually objects. You can do like dot name on a function. I'll show you quickly, even though we're over time. And you can get its name as a string. You know that there's a property on every function called name, which will give you a string, or undefined if it's anonymous.
So that f could be a variable itself.
F is a variable, right? It's a function, as we saw before. And it has many properties, such as name.
But I mean, if you wanted to list the names of all the functions that you had, like in a file.
No, that's not what this is useful for. This is just given a function, it is an object, which is crazy and a very JavaScript specific thing. Not super useful for what you need. It's more of an advanced thing. So if you don't understand this or don't care, that's okay. All right. Coming back to what else we covered. Yes, we didn't use the word, by the way. I usually use it at the very end because I don't like to start with the name that sounds scary and ominous and then define it, because you might have your own preconceived notions about what that is. So same thing with callbacks, right? We learned about functions. We learned that functions can take in functions. Right there, that is the definition of a higher order function. Nothing crazy. Higher order functions. Sounds crazy, but a higher order function is actually a math term. It's not even a computing term of a function that computes values of other functions. Okay, or it returns functions. So you can also have functions that return functions. We didn't cover that. More advanced, more confusing. Don't need to worry about it. Higher order functions can also not take in functions, but return functions, or maybe do both, right? So if they're operating with functions somehow, either taking them in or returning them, they're higher order functions. I don't care if you remember what they're called. I'm not going to quiz you on what is a higher order function, or at least not in a real world type quiz, right? Callbacks, what are those? Callbacks are nothing magical either. They sound they sound kind of crazy and mystical. A callback is when you pass a function into another function, it's meant to be called back, right? It's meant to be called by the higher order function. And therefore, it's it can be referred to as a callback function. Other terms for callback include delegate. It's a delegate function. It delegates the task to that function. I can't remember the other ones. Those are the big ones. Delegate, or I think predicate is the other one. Predicate function, delegate function, slightly mathy terms. In JavaScript, we generally call it, you'll hear the term callbacks a lot. So it's okay if you don't remember the synonyms. Callback, you don't have to try and memorize it. You'll remember the word callback. You'll come across it a lot. Okay. So before we adjourn, show me the callback functions. And show me the higher order functions. Higher order, why? The first item is not a function, but the second item is a function. Therefore, this for each backward is a higher order function. It operates on functions. So that's the only higher order function in this code, I believe, because it takes in a function. What are the callbacks in here? What are the callback functions? Print item, which is assigned to perform with item. So you're right that perform with item is a callback. You're correct. In this context, this is a callback function. So actually, you're more correct than I am. In this context, it's a callback function. Here, it's just a function, right? But then we decide to use it as a callback function by passing it in. JavaScript doesn't have a specific thing called callback functions. It's just using a function to be called back by another function is called a callback function. Just like JavaScript doesn't have a construct of higher order functions. It's just if you use a function that takes in a function, that's a higher order function. That's just what we call it in terms of math, right? JavaScript doesn't have like code that says this is a higher order function or this is a callback. That's just for humans talking with humans and describing things. We didn't get to talk about arrow functions. That's okay. That's just syntax. We'll get to them. They're just nicer ways of writing functions with slightly different behavior as well, right? We cover it a little bit in the curriculum, but you'll cover it more when you get to like React and stuff like that, where you actually start using them a lot. Okay. That's it. Sorry for finishing late. Any questions before I adjourn, though? It's okay, right? What are they gonna do? Fire me? No, I'm kidding. Yeah. Music library, I think you should tackle it. And if you're like, I'm not fully able to tackle it, then ask your peers first, or ask mentors. The other ones, I think should be okay to skip because they're getting into this, right? And functions on objects, which is a very important topic. But for today's material, let me confirm that, but it won't get in your way. Let me just quickly confirm that. So today's material talks about arrow functions, talks about functions and objects. I don't think it'll get in your way if you don't do the last two core from yesterday. But it will get in your way like for future weeks. So just, before the weekend ends, like get those ones done. Cool beans? All right, thanks for putting up with me, guys. I know I talk fast. Peace out. Okay.